Hello and welcome to Not Just Ads. This episode we have Stephen Almond, Executive Director, Regulatory Risk at the UK ICO. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And you started the 2025 with a bank, a very ambitious roadmap, and maybe we should also start from that.
Thank you so much. So yes, we started 2025 by setting out our strategy as the ICO, the UK's data protection regulator, for how we wanted to ensure that people have meaningful choice online over how they're tracked for advertising. We know that it's something that people really want to see in terms of their online experience, that people really love the benefits that personalization can provide, but that people want to see them have choice over that. And we know that when people aren't given choice over how they're tracked online, that harm can occur, whether that is gambling addicts who are being retargeted for further gambling offers because they have unwittingly and unintentionally agreed to further tracking of their online behaviours, whether that is people from different communities, for example, people who are exploring their sexuality, who are nervous about engaging online and nervous about what they are revealing about themselves, and so actually are starting to tailor their behaviour in order to avoid revealing too much of themselves online. And so our strategy that we have set out really represents a plan of action over the next 12 months to try and make sure that people are given that meaningful control over how they're tracked online. And there's a whole suite of actions in there intended to bring that about, from work with the top 1,000 publishers to make sure that people are given fair choices, that they are enabled to provide freely given consent when they're being tracked online, right the way through to actions that are focused on enabling organisations, particularly publishers, who are thinking, right, actually, how do I pivot or adjust my business model in the light of that, providing them with the clarity and certainty about how do they go about that. What would we expect if they are looking to implement a pay or okay style model? What would our expectations be around that? What would our expectations be in the future for people who are looking to actually pivot towards less personalised advertising? And what should they be able to expect from us by way not just of regulatory clarity, but also of regulatory incentives to reduce more intrusive tracking of people online? So there's a whole suite of action there. I'm looking forward to sort of diving in today. But I suppose make no mistake, the ICO does mean business this year.
You mentioned business models, and I think that one of the biggest issues, and I don't even know if that issue is easy to solve, is conflicting business models within digital media and digital advertising. And so what I thought is, reading what you publish, reading your blog posts, to pick some of the statements that you wrote and ask you specifically, maybe with concrete examples.
Sure, thank you.
So the first one, and I'm reading, says, we want to encourage publishers to deploy more privacy-preserving advertising, such as contextual models, and we will explore where the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, PECR, consent requirements are preventing such a shift. So the first question that came to my mind is, are you encouraging more ID-less, as they are called in the industry, versus ID solutions? What is your position on this?
So this is an area where, frankly, publishers themselves come to us all the time. We know that there are many publishers who would like to be able to deploy more privacy-preserving solutions in terms of online advertising, whether that's contextual advertising or alternatives in this area. But they know that in order for them to be able to make that business model work, for them to be able to monetize, they need to be able to do things like ad measurement. For example, they need to be able to demonstrate brand safety, and that is going to require some degree of really quite low risk tracking of individuals, where it's not really the intent in terms of being able to target people with content. It's not a kind of a higher risk purpose like that, but the intent really is actually just focused on, okay, how do we make sure that actually we're able to prove that people have seen an advert, for example. So we are looking at this from that perspective of risk. And actually, if you look at the standard for consent that is set out in the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations, it doesn't really differentiate between these higher risk and lower risk purposes. And so we know that there is an opportunity here for us to explore where those requirements in the what we call the PECA regulations to require consent for what might be deemed non-essential storage or access. We need to explore where actually that's setting too high a bar for people, and actually we could be lifting more privacy preserving forms of advertising out of those consent requirements, out of the cookie banners, the pop-ups that we know create friction for people and for businesses, while still making sure that people have control over how they're tracked online, where their data is being used for more intrusive purposes, like being targeted for adverts.
If I well understand, so you're saying there might be some solution for identifying the user, privacy preserving, that will not need consent?
So what we are looking at is there, I suppose, kind of a viable model here that would not require consent. And what we are saying is that we will explore that, we'll openly consult with industry. And what we would aim to do as the regulator, being very aware that we as a regulator ourselves cannot change the law, but what we can say is that actually the risk associated with processing, where, for example, you are the only processing that is taking place in terms of access or storage on device for the purposes of ad measurement, for example, actually we could get to a point where we say, okay, actually, yes, technically that wouldn't be allowed under the law, but actually we as the ICO may not enforce in that sort of circumstance. It's probably about as far as we as a regulator can go without an actual change in the law. But of course, in parallel, there are changes to the law being made. We have the Data Use and Access bill being passed through Parliament, and that does provide for the government to pass secondary legislation, increasing the number of exemptions that are available to the PECA regulations. So what you might see here is, and let's see how our work here, how our analysis progresses. And of course, I do not wish to in any way bind the government here, but what you might see here is a precursor to some lightening of the load of consent requirements more generally. So I hope that provides comfort and incentives, frankly, for people to start investing, start thinking about business models that could be deployed that are more privacy preserving. It's an area where we really want to see the creativity, the innovation that the ad industry is famed for, kind of brought to bear in terms of that. And we do get plenty of people knocking on our doors saying, I would really love to trial this sort of business model. If I could just find some sort of exemption to the PECA regulations here. And what we're saying is, actually, we might be able to get to a point where we could start exploring some of that.
I think a lot of people will start becoming antsy at these statements, which I find very interesting because also will show the road to innovation towards that direction of more privacy-preserving solutions. But you also mentioned publishers come to us and ask. And as a non-legal expert, it's fascinating to me in the industry where there is this kind of remark, the ICO or the regulators must tell us what it means. But is it normal that the law has to be explained and you have this back and forth between different players, entities, companies in the industry, or is it very peculiar of digital advertising? And unpicking it's complex.
It's really not unique to digital advertising in any way, shape or form. And we actually encourage organisations to come to us. We have a variety of services from our regulatory sandbox where organisations can partner with us. And we have some advertising solutions which are being tested and trialled in our regulatory sandbox. We have an innovation advice service where people can ask questions about how we're interpreting the law. Because ultimately we want to give organisations every opportunity to get it right. I don't want to be the regulator that turns around having not told people how to get to the right place and simply say, oh, you got it wrong, now we're going to intervene. We want to give the organisations every opportunity to really understand our direction of travel. And I think that's really what our online tracking strategy is aiming to signal to the industry. This is going to be a big year of change. We are expecting some major transitions, but we are providing every piece of guidance and clarity that we can to help organisations reach that point where they are complying not just with the law, but actually with what their customers are expecting with them.
So no excuses. The ICO is open to explain, support, and provide examples.
Indeed.
What I love in your recent tests and blogs is the reference of tackling the first mover disadvantage. This is crucial. I've seen plenty along the years, plenty of companies that have been penalized from a business perspective for doing the right thing. So how are you planning to tackle and make sure that there is no first mover disadvantage? Because it's known in the industry, a lot of people wait until the very last moment, until they can't do otherwise.
I would really recommend to people that this is not a year to wait. And let me explain why. Because I really see this in my own conversations with data protection officers, and a couple in their more indiscreet moments will say to me, we would love to make this shift, but we know that the moment we make this shift, we will be losing revenue compared to our competitors. And that will ultimately put them at significant disadvantage. And look, actually, this is where it is crucial that there is a level playing field. We know that, of course, the web is comprised of millions of sites from publishers. And so actually it requires us to not just be able to say, okay, we're going to come for a random selection this year, but actually it requires everybody to have confidence that we are looking everywhere all of the time around this. And we do see, and for those of you who are listening to this, who are thinking, okay, well, we're very, we're going to develop a great model of changing our practices and then changing them back when we think the ICO is not looking. I can assure you that we're looking very hard at how we do real-time monitoring across a very large set of websites. And that is why we have set ourselves this target of going across the 1,000 most frequented websites across this year. If you are within or close to that category, you should be taking every step right now, because there has been a very clear set of messages that we will be looking at your practices and we will be taking action. And we're kind of beyond the point now for excuses around that. How would we do that? We've been clear that actually the only way to really police across the web is to use digital technologies ourselves. So whether that is to have automated capture of how cookies are set or how publishers' websites are presented at particular points in time, whether that's automated analysis of those sorts of things. I won't speak too much to our internal toolkit because I don't wish to create opportunities for gaming here. But what I would say is that organisations should be prepared for a future where the ICO does have eyes across the whole of the landscape all of the time.
Message loud and clear. And it takes us back to consent. There is another point where you're saying we also plan to engage further with consent management platforms, CMPs, who are central to how many organizations manage online consent and tracking permission. Should Adtech be an enabler? So the question is, should the strategy and compliance be starting from the actual entity that is visited by the audience, in example, the publisher? Why this specific reference to CMPs? Because I see them as the ones that help the actual entity to collect consent.
Well, indeed, they're playing that pivotal role in the ecosystem of helping organisations, in theory, to comply with the law. But where they are offering default settings to publishers which are not compliant with the law, actually that isn't helping. And so we really expect consent management platforms to be offering publishers defaults that enable them to comply with the law. Of course, if publishers subsequently make changes, etc., to deviate, then that is on them. But consent management platforms consequently play a really important role. And so we are looking at the role that they're playing. We're looking at actually whether or not we should be saying specifically to publishers, here are some consent management platforms that enable you to comply with the law. And here are some that we would not recommend because they are not enabling you in the first instance without significant tailoring to comply with our regulatory expectations. And so in the same way that I'm hoping that publishers sit up and listen, I'm really hoping that consent management platforms sit up and listen around this. They are a set of businesses that trade on being able to give publishers trust and confidence that they're doing the right thing to comply with the law. And I think if they are not enabling that, then we have quite a serious problem here. Of course, not all consent management platforms are necessarily just operating as a processor under the instruction of publishers themselves. Many of them also have accessory functions as well. So we should expect that we'll be looking across the range of their operations.
This is quite interesting because everybody has always said enforcement is very hard. But in between the lines, almost interpreting it as a looking for first barriers for compliance. So making everybody accountable so that nobody can hide behind other parts of the industry's roles.
We think that everybody in the Adtech supply chain has an obligation to enable organisations to comply, even if that's not a direct obligation in terms of their accountability under the law. But ultimately, this is about enabling what our customers, the users, really expect here. We know that they expect to be given meaningful control over how their information is used. This is about following through on that expectation.
This is also connected with withdrawing consent. And so we are being very clear about it.
We are being very clear that consent has to be as easy to withdraw as to give, and that at present, for some publishers, it is extremely easy for me to press an accept button and have my personal information shared with over 1,000 different parties. And then there is an expectation somehow that if I am to reverse that, I need to identify each of those over 1,000 different parties and engage with them individually to try and withdraw my consent. That is not, it clearly is not a case where consent is as easy to withdraw as it was to provide. We have seen actually some great attempts by parts of industry to really explore solutions to this problem. For those of you who haven't looked at the IAB Tech Labs data deletion framework, they are starting to propose solutions to this, recognizing that actually some of the technical solutions are going to need to be built up industry-wide in order to tackle this. And I think what we're really doing is providing the regulatory power to people's elbows on this, so that they are actually confident that when they are proposing these sorts of solutions, they will get an audience for them, because actually organisations should expect, and they should look through some of our recent cases and case law in this area, they should expect that we, and indeed other regulators, will be pushing around how easy it is to withdraw your consent.
And I've heard conversations and positions around the industry where people are panicking, saying, how on earth will we be able to go through the whole chain of RTB and all the different vendors and delete and withdraw consent and delete the data for that specific user?
I would hope that panic translates into creativity and innovation here. We are seeing some, as I've mentioned with the IAB framework, we're seeing some credible proposals emerge here for how to tackle that problem. It's definitely a problem that can be solved. It's not technically infeasible, but what we do need is the willpower, the investment, the resources to actually go in and make that happen.
And it raises also another interesting question. It's about the fact that a lot of the issues that the ICO is dealing with is not because of the law, is because of the, or better, a lot of the complexity is not because of the law, it's because of RTB, for example, works and programmatic advertising works. So I kind of interpret what you just said in the last 25 minutes, that it's Adtech having to adapt to the law. The attempts to make it softer will not have a lot of success. Is that correct?
So I think it's really important to reflect here that actually what we're talking about is people's expectations here in terms of how their information is processed. And that's really what the law codifies here, is what people are expecting by way of being able to freely give choice around being tracked, whether it's around being able to withdraw their consent easily. What we need to see here is the industry move in the direction that reflects those consumer expectations around how people's data is processed. And that's really what's codified here in the law. So I wouldn't necessarily frame it just as a mismatch between kind of the technical architecture and the law, but actually it's around coming into line with social expectations. And what we do find when we do in-depth studies with people and we explain what is happening under the hood in terms of the processing of their personal information, a lot of people are surprised, and surprised not in a good way, about quite what is happening with their personal information. And it's incumbent, I think, on all of us to make sure that we are meeting those expectations.
If I attach the word fingerprinting to what you just said, what would you tell me?
So I would say much the same story here. The ICO has been really very vocal in expressing its concerns around fingerprinting as a potential method for tracking people online. It can be deployed compliantly, but it is hard to do so. And it is very hard to do so in a way which gives users meaningful choice and control over how they are being tracked online. So we have been very clear, particularly in response to the changes announced by Google, that they were looking to permit at least the use of data sourced through fingerprinting through Google Ads. We have expressed strong and ongoing concern around that as an approach, and organisations who are looking to deploy those approaches should really read our guidance that is out in draft form right now on storage and access technologies, which really provides you with clear guidance on how to do so in compliance with the law. It is possible to deploy in compliance with the law. It is a hard task, but if organisations want to go down that path, we really recommend that they do so by following through on our guidance.
And if I tell you consent or pay, that's another very top of mind topic. Kind of a pet obsession of mine. I'm kind of an isolated voice, almost isolated. I don't think that your data or your money is actually a good way to embrace your audience, to engage with your audience. Yes, I always say if we take a snapshot of the last 6 months, yes, publishers are with their back behind the wall, against the wall. They need to do something to get consent. I'm thinking GDPR is 7 years old, plus the years in preparation to it. There was a lot of time to get ready to it. Now, I can see that there is the ICO is trying to help overcome this big issue. What is the official position?
So just to step back from consent or pay for a moment, we recognise that we're at a point where, because we are enforcing against models that don't comply with regulatory expectations, there are a number of publishers who are grappling with the choices about what to replace these models with. We're trying to provide real clarity for organisations around how they can move to alternative compliant models, whether that is just straightforward accept or reject in terms of tracking, whether that is about moving towards more privacy-preserving advertising and an aspiration that we share around taking that out of some of the expectations that might exist for consent, or whether that is around exploring consent or pay models. And so there is a variety of different business models that publishers really can explore here. When it comes to consent or pay models, we have provided clear guidance following our consultation last year, which sets out our expectations of organisations in terms of what they need to be considering in order to be able to demonstrate that consent gathered in that sort of situation is gathered freely. And so that comes down to weighing up factors such as the power balance between the organisation and the user, the extent to which somebody really has a choice about whether or not they use the service. It comes down to the equivalence of the choices offered. It comes down to questions around the fee that you set. Ultimately, in providing this clarity to organisations around how these models operate, we're trying to give organisations the freedom to choose the right model for their business. We recognise that we need to provide routes for people to carry out their businesses lawfully in this area. And we also are deeply conscious of the fact that currently a lot of the funding for online content is backed up by an online advertising model, which it's at a point of needing to adapt. And so this is really one of the several routes that we are trying to signal where organisations and how organisations could deploy these sorts of approaches compliantly. Of course, we're not in the position of telling organisations which business model to use.
Sure. But what I usually tell organizations right at the time where they need to diversify their business models is, okay, an anonymous user that has never visited your page, how will that user be able to sample your content, understand that he wants to pay if he has to choose first, if he wants to give you the data or if he has to pay? But that's, I mean, I don't know what you think about it. That was just a thought that I'm throwing there.
I think kind of turning to those kind of three alternative business models that I highlighted there of a potential consent free kind of contextual advertising or privacy preserving advertising model in future, a consent-based tracking model where you have accept or reject choices that are presented freely, and a consent or pay tracking model, that you can see that those three different choices in terms of business models have very different levels of user friction and, frankly, kind of good customer experience. And for in terms of the incentives that creates, I'm hoping that will create some real kind of leaps and bounds of innovation for organisations around thinking, well, actually, how could I pivot towards more privacy preserving advertising that will really enable people to engage with my content without having lots of additional friction, whilst still enabling the organisation to deploy advertising and monetize their content.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for these insights and guidance. And before I let you go to way more important tasks, I usually ask my guests, what would you advise a small, medium, but even a big publisher to do in order to approach your 2025 roadmap? How should they interact and engage with you?
So, step one here, I think, for any kind of existing publisher in this space is to look at our expectations here in terms of online tracking and really self-assess and go, right, actually, to what extent am I meeting those expectations? I've said already 2025 is going to be a year of change for organisations who are in a position when they do that assessment of finding that they aren't compliant. Please do not wait for us to knock on your door. We will perhaps not be the friendliest of knocks on the door by the time that we arrive. Please get your house in order right now. For those of you who are looking at alternatives, I mean, first of all, we've provided very clear alternatives in terms of what can be done in compliant ways, and we expect organisations to make sure as a matter of urgency that they are doing compliant processing. But where they have questions about new models around things that we've not thought of, and my goodness, I'd hope that there's more innovation in business models than just a regulator can think up. If organisations want to come and test their new ideas with us, please, you are most welcome. Reach out to us through our innovation advice service, through our regulatory sandbox, through me, through any of our different portals. We'll always be happy to try and provide that clarity for organisations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for having been with us. All the best with your job.
Thank you.